Hello, and welcome to another online presentation from Biometric Update. We discuss the hot topics and important issues involved in biometrics and digital identity, and I am your host, Chris Burt. Today, we're going to talk about responsible and ethical commercial biometrics with an exceptional panel. I'm very pleased to say that with both the breadth and depth of knowledge of our four panelists today, we are sure to have a very insightful and engaging conversation. The long-term prospects for practical applications of biometric technology will depend largely on ethical considerations and its responsible development and use. How responsible and ethical businesses and governments are in their deployments and how responsible and ethical those deployments are perceived as being are crucial for the long-term health of the industry. Responsible and ethical deployments are also critical to prevent harms from biometrics as a powerful technology, both on an individual basis and to society as a whole. What exactly responsible and ethical biometrics deployments mean is a subject of ongoing debate, and we are hoping to contribute to that debate and dialogue today. We'll start by narrowing it down a little bit, and today we're going to be focusing on commercial biometrics. We want to give businesses both developing biometrics and thinking about using biometrics a starting point for thinking productively about what they should do and what they shouldn't do. Joining us today, we have Isabelle Moeller, the Chief Executive of the Biometrics Institute, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with, as the international organization promoting the responsible and ethical use of biometrics. The Institute has produced several resources that provide guidance in this area, and I'm sure that over the course of our discussion today, we'll be referring to some of those. So thank you very much for joining us, Isabelle. We also have with us David Oberly, who is the Biometrics Team Lead at Baker Donelson's Data Protection, Privacy, and Cybersecurity Practice. David is an expert in the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, America's most impactful biometrics regulation. He has penned a series of excellent posts for Biometric Update about BIPA and regulation around the US, helping us to really understand the legal landscape. And I want to actually take this opportunity to wish you a happy belated birthday, David.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us as well. We also have Jeremy Grant, Managing Director of Technology Business Strategy at Venable LLP in the firm's cybersecurity consulting practice. Jeremy has also held other senior positions in identity management and privacy, most notably for our present discussion at NIST. Wonderful to have you with us today, Jeremy.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invite.
And we also have Stephanie Schuckers with us, who is a professor at Clarkson University, a director as well at the Biometrics Institute, and the chair of the biometrics subgroup at the FIDO Alliance, to give a brief encapsulation of Stephanie's great qualifications. Stephanie is also the director of the Center for Identification Technology Research, known throughout the industry as CITER. And thank you for joining us today as well, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the discussion, I want to run over a few quick housekeeping items. We are recording this presentation, and all of you lucky attendees will be emailed the link so that when you have to take that irritating phone call in a few minutes, you can just go back afterwards and watch that part and listen to our discussion again. We are going to open the discussion up to audience participation at the end as well. Please submit questions using the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'm going to ask for something a little different today as well. I'm also going to invite comments. So feel free to submit your questions and your comments as we carry out the conversation and as well at the end when we throw open the floor. We may not have time to get to everyone's thoughts, but we are full of ambition on that front, so let's get to it. I'd like to start by asking Jeremy, maybe you can give us a view into some of the aspects of ethical and responsible biometrics beyond regulatory and legal compliance. What are some of the gaps between statutory obligations and those beyond the law that we should watch out for?
Thanks. It's a great question to kick off with, in that, look, both David and I both sit in law firms, and there's a lot of issues around regulatory and legal compliance that come up. But I think there's a bigger question when you're using biometrics, just given that there can be risks in some cases that go beyond that, which is, what is the need for biometrics? Why are you looking to use them? How are you looking to use them? Is it the right technology to use? I think, and to be clear, I'm somebody who's generally an enthusiast about biometrics and the value that it can provide, but sometimes you'll see somebody racing toward an embrace of the technology without actually contemplating what the problem is they're trying to solve. I think beyond that, there's often a need for some sort of a risk assessment that goes beyond the regulatory and the legal compliance side, particularly when it looks at things like security, privacy, inclusion or exclusion in some cases, trying to just understand, okay, look, here's what the law says we have to do, but let's take a more holistic look at some of the risks as well. And here, having come from NIST, I'm a big fan of things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, the NIST privacy framework, as a way to actually be able to look sort of more holistically at risk and, assess, some of the potential issues around it. I think there's also a lot of questions with biometrics, and I think we'll dive into this a little bit more today. Are you storing data? And, how, if at all? How do you secure it? How do you govern access to it? Particularly as we talk about biometric systems that rely on, databases of biometrics and central matching, that tends to become a big issue. Are there secondary uses of the data beyond just what it's being collected for, used for, initially, and other restrictions of that? I think another thing that we're increasingly seeing, I know my old colleagues at NIST are focusing a lot on that, is for whatever the application, what happens if biometrics don't work? Since while they're becoming a lot more accurate, a lot more reliable, there are still maybe parts of the population that they don't work for a whole variety of different reasons. And so NIST is currently thinking, for example, in the context of remote identity verification, the concept of optionality, which is, if you're an organization that has biometrics in there as a primary tool, okay, if it doesn't work for you, what's the fallback? How are there different paths to try and get through things? My general take, and I think we'll talk about this today, is, there are horror stories that are out there around biometrics, particularly when we start to get into the criminal ecosystem, and you hear stories of people being falsely arrested when a face recognition system backfired or whatnot. My take is those horror stories have as much to do around the inaccuracy or the problem with the technology as how they're actually being deployed, because you haven't seen the implementers actually think through some of these questions that we're talking about. And so I think, as will become clear today, the technology is part of it, but the processes and just sort of the thinking you do around how you actually implement the technology, that's really where things become much more important.
So it sounds like it's really crucial for people to take their time in making each of these decisions, starting with, why are we doing this, and do we need to do this, and then at each progressive step. Is that fair to say?
I would say so.
And I also just want to mention or repeat, Jeremy just referred to NIST resources that can be used to help make some of these assessments. So we're going to be touching on a lot of different resources today, and I just want to call them out as we come across them, so that people can pursue those on their own. I'd also like to ask our other panelists just to weigh in on that same point about gaps. Anyone?
I think Jeremy made two great points. The first one about having a secondary option. It's not only a ethical and responsible thing to do, but also, especially in the employment context with fingerprints, there are certain religious objections that if you don't have a non-biometric system or function in, that it can raise Title VII religious discrimination issues. So that's one area to think of where the ethics and the legal areas converge with one another. And the second thing is that Jeremy talked about conducting assessments, and that's not only an ethical and responsible thing to do, but the FTC is really developing a position where these are now they're going to look for risk assessments prior to deployment being done. Both it's referenced both in their biometrics policy statement and also in the Rite Aid settlement. And then also beyond post-deployment to continue monitoring those tools to make sure they're being deployed in a responsible manner by customers, and so that they're not having a discriminatory or otherwise unfair impact on end users and consumers.
Great points. That careful consideration may begin sooner than you think. It may extend later than you think as well with that continuous process. And David also raises the intersection between responsible biometrics use and other not necessarily specifically biometrics focused legislation and regulation, right? Stephanie or Isabelle, would you like to weigh in on at that point, or should I? We're gonna move along to a question I'd like to direct to Isabelle, actually, which is for businesses trying to select a biometric modality for their project, is one easier to implement ethically and responsibly?
Chris, that's a great question. And the reason I didn't comment, because it kind of nicely leads on to what Jeremy and David said before. I mean, I could do a tick on everything Jeremy said. Why use a biometrics? It's about risk assessments. What are you doing with the data? And I think too often organizations have taken exactly that approach of, well, which modality? And that is exactly why the Biometrics Institute, for example, tried to find a simple way to remind organizations that that's not where you should start. You should really think about the problem you're trying to solve and whether biometrics are the right choice. And that's why we devised, and I obviously brought it here with me, our lovely 3 laws of biometrics, which are inspired by Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. So we try to find a simple way, and it's really about the policy has to come first. You have to think really whether the use of the biometric is proportionate and with basic human rights, ethics, and privacy at its heart. And then that leads on to you thinking about the process. And again, Jeremy said that. Are the right safeguards in place? And really to make sure that all the decisions that you make about the implementation have been rigorously reviewed, and that the operations are fair, and that the operators are accountable. And once you've done all that, then of course you have to think about the technology. And then comes that question, which modality? And there's a lot to know, and Stephanie will talk more about that, about knowing your algorithm and your biometric system and your data and the testing and the vulnerabilities. But I thought about your question, and I kind of came up with, I concluded there were probably 5 things that came to my mind in terms of which modality. And the first, again, is going back to that question, what is that problem? Is it a security or identity assurance situation? Is that what you're trying to address? And what is it you're protecting? And at what point do you need to decide that the identity needs to be verified? And therefore, what is the best suited modality? So, for example, take a high security environment where people maybe wear masks and gloves and glasses, potentially ear biometrics. They exist, and we haven't talked terribly much about them, but I believe the ear is fairly unique to a person. Perception is a big issue. The audience that you're targeting with your implementation, they might have a perception, and in the past that was often the case. Fingerprints were something that you used to find criminals. I think that has really changed through Touch ID, but nowadays there's a lot of talk about the face, and it's very public. So maybe that's not the right choice, and you need to think that through. Novelty, I thought, is an interesting one. When you look at Amazon, what they've done in their stores, you can just walk in with your hand. And some people who might be kind of having a certain tech snobbery think that's cool. Look what I do to pay. And I've gone way past the phone and touchless pay. But of course, convenience, and we're talking about commercial biometrics, that's the big one for a lot of organizations. And the practicality, is it a good customer experience? Is it maybe giving me a competitive advantage? And, you know, the banking apps with the face technology, I mean, it is so seamless. It's simply wonderful. I love it. And finally, the last one I thought about in terms of your modality is, of course, cost as well. The cost to the organization implementing the technology. And from what I understand, in a service environment, a large-scale consumer service environment, the fallout can cost you easily up to $1 million to just basically deal with the fact that you have a failure rate in your system. So I guess coming back to your question originally, is there a modality that's easier or to implement ethically and responsibly? And I think the summary is you've got to do your homework, and there's a lot you have to consider, but there's a lot of guidance available.
Good thing we've got that guidance, considering all of these various factors that need to be weighed in. And something that occurred to me, Isabelle, as you were describing the cost and having just mentioned the proliferation of identity verification through face biometrics and banking apps and stuff like that. And something that, one of the ways that can play out, of course, is that costs get passed on to consumers. Well, if we're trying to allow people to open bank accounts, then we don't necessarily want to create a situation where it becomes cost prohibitive to be financially inclusive, right? And this feeds back into the responsibility that organizations have when implementing biometrics. Anyone else like to weigh in on that point about modalities and the various considerations?
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. And so Isabelle brought up the know your algorithm. And so I think, we're going to talk quite a bit about that in the future questions, So, I think the question is not going to be about what modality to use. Your question needs to be about the actual implementation, right? I have people say, which algorithm is the most, or which modality is the most secure, right? Wrong question, right? It's really about the implementation. And another aspect to think about is choice. Jeremy brought back your fallback plan, right? So to the extent your use case enables choice, I think that's a really important aspect, because choice increases the possibility that you get the coverage across your customers. And I think people kind of forget that sometimes, when they think about biometrics and want a one-size-fits-all solution. And so, certainly, to the extent you can take advantage of, technology that people have in their hands through various ways of working with biometrics, which we'll get into, with your mobile devices, that certainly gives both choice and coverage for individuals.
And then just to piggyback on Stephanie's comment about knowing your algorithm, again, FTC's really focusing on policing biometrics. And if you don't know your algorithm, you may be making marketing claims that are deceptive. And that's one of the FTC's key points that they're going to be scrutinizing. So if you need to know your algorithm and know your limitations on it so that you're not saying the wrong things and finding yourself in trouble with the FTC.
Very interesting. Yeah, but very good points. Thank you, Stephanie and David. Both points that we're going to be coming back to as well. And yeah, the challenges of business considerations, of marketing, and being responsible really create a certain tension there that. As someone who covers the industry and reads a lot of press releases, I can tell you I've seen some very bold claims that are well founded and backed up, and I've seen some pretty bold claims that I'm not so sure about. So that doesn't make it easier for businesses, but it is part of the challenge that we have to work through when discussing these issues. So. Yeah, really important to keep in mind the shift that has been happening in the landscape. And so, you know what, David, I'd like to actually come right back to you on Illinois in particular. I mean, that's at the state level. This is, you know, this is the big legislation. This is where the largest number of lawsuits, not just in the United States, but in the world, really, about biometric data protection are coming from. So can you give us an overview of what it means for businesses to collect consent to use people's biometrics in a compliant way in Illinois?
Sure. To give you some background, many of you have heard of the Rosenbach case, 2019 Illinois Supreme Court case. They recognize that BIPA is at its core an informed consent statute, and informed consent is comprised of two components, notice and consent. So at the heart of this informed consent regime is Section 15B of BIPA, which imposes a pre-collection consent requirement. It refers to a written release, which is defined as informed written consent, or in the context of an employment, a release executed by an employee as a condition of employment. However, there's another sometimes overlooked aspect of BIPA consent, which is found in the disclosure provision, Section 15D, which requires that consent be obtained before disclosing or disseminating any biometric data to any third parties. And in the absence of consent, you can only disclose any biometric data if one of three exemptions applies. Those relate to financial transactions, and when the disclosures are required by law or required to respond to a subpoena or warrant. So while a lot of companies see at first blush these consent requirements being fairly straightforward and simple to comply with, when trying to operationalize this component, there's a lot of complexities and challenges. And technology developers and suppliers in particular, they have a really difficult task. And this is due primarily to not being able to interface with the end users of their technology. But unfortunately, not to the surprise of anyone that's even vaguely familiar with BIPA litigation, courts have interpreted the law extremely broadly and found that these requirements extend to vendors and technology providers just the same as their customers or other types of companies that use biometrics and have a direct relationship with end users.
And that, which raises the importance of acting responsibly and taking responsibility, both for the business doing this hard work of getting the implementation right, but also for the technology developers as well, right?
And there are a lot of companies that have tried to argue once in BIPA litigation that they don't have an obligation to comply with 15B, which is notice and consent, because they don't have the opportunity to give it or obtain consent. And courts have almost in uniform fashion said that there's nothing in the text that says that, and we're going to hold you responsible for those, even if compliance is more difficult.
So in a sense, they're responsible for what their partners are doing.
Correct. And that goes in the issue of contractual language that needs to allocate responsibilities between the parties and have strong indemnification language so that if the counterparty does fail to comply, that the other non-responsible party is not left holding the bag.
Right, and a costly bag it can be. David, can you maybe expand on that in terms of contrasting and comparing with consent requirements in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, if we move outside of Illinois, the other biometrics laws, the two main ones similar to BIPA are in Washington and Texas. Washington doesn't have a fancy acronym for its law, but it's usually referred to as HB 1493. And in Texas, it's the Capture or Use of Biometric Identifiers Act, or CUBI. Both these laws require pre-collection consent, but the requirements are relaxed a little bit. Neither law requires that consent to be in writing. And Washington's law also says that it can be context dependent. So it gives a little bit of flexibility for companies to achieve compliance with this aspect of the law. In terms of pre-disclosure consent, both laws also require that. Washington's essentially the same in terms of its pre-collection and pre-disclosure rules. Does not have to be in writing. With Texas, it's a lot more complex because you can only get consent to disclose biometric data in the event of someone's death or disappearance. So that really limits the scope of what you can do, of how you can get disclosure and how you can get consent in order to disclose biometric data. And there's just 3 narrow exemptions that apply there, like BIPA, if you don't get consent. And then if we go beyond the biometrics laws, the new consumer privacy statutes, they all require consent with the exception of Utah and Iowa. When processing biometric data for identification purposes, Utah and Iowa only require notice and opportunity to opt out. And then we also have new consumer health data privacy laws. The most commonly known one is Washington's My Health, My Data Act. These also have both pre-collection and pre-disclosure consent requirements, but they're unique in some ways as well. For example, there's additional requirements that consent for collection and consent for disclosure be obtained completely separate and independent of one another. And then hark back on the FTC because they're so interested in scrutinizing biometrics. There's no federal law. Section 5 is the FTC's primary law that it enforces. It doesn't have any explicit requirement, but it's been a long-standing position of the FTC that affirmative express consent is required when collecting biometric data, or including when collecting sensitive data, which is generally understood to include biometric data. And it has also imposed affirmative express consent requirements in some of its settlement orders with facial recognition.
Absolutely. So that raises a couple of really important points, and one that I'd like to sort of extend to countries all around the world, which is you mentioned, David, that sensitive personal information is typically considered to include biometric data. This is also the case when we're talking about GDPR in Europe. When we're talking about data privacy and protection laws in Canada, Australia, throughout many countries in Asia and around the world. So we end up seeing, even if we have different laws in different jurisdictions, we're going to see these same concepts all over the place, both from a legal perspective and just from a purely ethical perspective. So we'd like to invite any of our panelists to weigh in, either on the situation in the United States or more broadly, the issue of consents. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I just wanted to, I'm going to sort of answer that question, but I wanted to riff a little bit on what David was saying, which is BIPA is getting a lot of attention in the US, and I'd actually argue globally, more than some of the other state privacy laws, in that I don't think the consent provisions of it are particularly unreasonable. It's the penalties that is really what is drawing so much attention, because the way the law has been crafted is that, if I'm running a hamburger joint and I've got, biometric, attendants to clock in and clock out every day, and I'm not capturing consent properly, each time for each employee that somebody uses that twice a day, that's a violation, which, you are seeing add up to millions or even billions of dollars of potential damages. And I think it's getting a ton of attention, in part because the penalties on the financial side are not just high, but completely disproportionate to any other violations of any federal or state laws or regulations on the privacy side. And so, these numbers being so enormous are getting everybody's attention. Look, in some cases in a good way, people are really focused on consent right now in other areas of compliance. But, I would argue that if that law was tweaked a little bit to ensure that the penalties are more proportionate with the other, other types of penalties that you would see for similar violations from a privacy and security standpoint, this law would be getting a lot less attention than it is today.
Just to give you an example there, the defendant in the Cawthorn case, which is the Illinois Supreme Court case that held that per scan violations are the law of the land for BIPA. The defendant argued that its class of 10,000, it was less than 10,000 employees who are using fingerprint scanners would expose the company to like $17 billion in potential damages. And the Illinois Supreme Court said that's your problem, not ours. This is how the law is written. There's usually every year there's BIPA amendments, proposed amendments introduced in the Illinois legislature. Obviously, they've never passed, but we'll see maybe one of these days. But I wouldn't keep your hopes up.
Yeah, I feel like I've probably written an article about a proposed BIPA set of BIPA amendments about every 6 to 12 months, and then as the cycle goes forward, we get to the end of that legislative period and or the beginning of the next one, and we say, well, this is like the last one, which didn't make it through. So yeah, definitely. But at the same time, these court cases are yielding slightly different interpretations, right? We didn't think in terms of these same multi-billion-dollar damages just a few years ago, right?
Yeah, Cawthorn turned exposure in the millions to exposure in the upwards of billion, if not more, for even smaller companies.
So, I mean, this is a situation where it's not necessarily alleged that someone's identity has been stolen. It's actually really a consent issue, right?
Correct. There does not have to be any actual injury or damage to recover those statutory damages. Violation of the laws is all that's needed for consumers or other types of individuals to recover in class action litigation.
Seems like a very important point when discussing the ethics and responsibility of using this technology, that the worst case scenario does not have to be introduced in terms of harms to people for the business to see serious consequences, right?
And Chris, maybe to add, because from conversations we are seeing, consent is a difficult one in some ways as well, because what do people actually understand consent really is? I recall in Australia, a shopping mall introduced these cameras to see who's coming in, and they had a very small notice in the corner somewhere. So people could debate, how much notice has really been given. And in terms of the recommendations we are making is obviously, again, when you shape your policy around your implementation, you need to have meaningful stakeholder consultations and privacy impact assessments. And during that phase, you would hope that even apart from all the laws that are out there or are not out there, when you do that, it would be in the interest of the organization to make this a successful implementation, that you're clear what consent actually means to your target audience. So I think, again, it's back to my point earlier, you have to do your homework. Aside from laws that exist or don't exist, we've published ethical principles. Ultimately, you want us humans to live a happy and safe and good life. And so to push implementations that down the track, have impact on your business, but also on the broader community, is that really in the interest of what you're doing? So a lot of it is also common sense and engaging with the people who will be affected by that technology.
Absolutely. And I just want to call out there Isabelle's mention of the Biometrics Institute's ethical principles. This is another resource that you can use for guidance as you work through some of these challenging decisions, including how big does our sign need to be? If you're a business, this is a real question. So, as it is one of many, it's going to be a long process maybe to get that policy just right. That's kind of what I'm hearing. I'd like to actually ask Stephanie now a little bit about, you referred earlier to the use of people's mobile devices as a collection point for biometrics, something that they have control over. And there is definitely a trend that we've noticed towards implementations at the network edge on people's own devices. FIDO, the work of the FIDO Alliance, Fast Identity or Fast ID Online, being the most prominent example, though not the only one. A lot of that is motivated by considerations around user control and privacy. So what are some circumstances in which you would consider that kind of architecture responsible or preferable because responsible?
Yep, thanks for the question. So yeah, FIDO Alliance, this is open specifications for authentication. So that's its primary focus, and it is built by stakeholders from around the world. So if you go to the FIDO Alliance website, you can look at who the stakeholders are. They include all the major tech companies, as well as consumer businesses, as well as the ecosystem of the OEMs that build our devices, and ultimately the relying parties and governments too, right? So these stakeholders went together and built these systems. So it's open specifications that is implemented today. It's in all the major browsers. It's most likely built right into your device today. It's built into Android, Microsoft, and Apple systems. And so what does it do? Like, what's biometrics in all of this, and why do we consider that and fitting into the ethical and responsible use? It's because, as you mentioned, the biometric reference, or the thing you're comparing against, the data related to the biometric, is locally stored. So basically, the way the protocol works is you prove yourself to the device, and then the device is proving itself to the relying party through something called public key cryptography. And so it's about moving beyond passwords and shared secrets to phishing resistant processes. And why do I say phishing resistant? Because many of our second factors that we use today, such as sending a text, that has a number, are not phishing resistant. We are susceptible. We are the weak link, in the process. And so by moving beyond that to a FIDO authentication, we can move beyond some of our traditional shared secrets. So why do we need that? We need that today because of things are broken, right? Data is stolen all the time. Our accounts are hacked into, identity theft. And so this is really about moving, the needle in terms of these types of things. And so I do think, fundamentally the way it's been built to begin with, it's kind of privacy built in, right? If your organization is looking to advance and move beyond passwords and shared secrets to this, I think you can feel like, boom, it's done, right? So some of these real concerns that we're talking about today for implementations, you get beyond them immediately. If, you're thinking, oh, but I'm looking and I would just love to, snap a photograph in my app and put it into my cloud system, at my organization, my bank, I think you really do, have more worries, I would say, than you would if you want to adopt, an internationally accepted form of authentication. So as far as other implementations out there, then you want to be asking about what is happening to the data, where is the data going, how is that data protected? Of course, the know your algorithms, which we already talked about. And I also do want to mention, if the major companies have now moved to call this passkey, something that's been around. So, I have started to notice that I'm seeing that pop up as an option, and just to understand that I equate FIDO and passkey are similar or are the same, literally the same, just the naming of it.
Just
Great.
to weigh
Jeremy.
with a couple additional points on FIDO, and Stephanie gave a great introduction. I think one of the things that we're seeing, at least in the authentication space, which, mind you, we started off by talking about if you're using biometrics, what problem are you trying to solve? So authentication is password replacement or MFA. That's not the same as identity proofing, where you might need different types of biometric solutions and might need to store or match them in different places. For authentication, I think a lot of the world has come to the conclusion that you can have the benefits of biometrics without a lot of the risks through an architecture like FIDO, where you're just matching the biometric in the device to then unlock a private key. I do a lot of work with financial institutions, and a friend who's the CISO at one told me a few years ago, I'd like to use biometrics, but as for storing them, I might as well be storing toxic waste from a risk perspective, and that something's going to go wrong somewhere and they'll be compromised, and then where are we going to be? And it's just not worth it. So we really like FIDO because we get, a lot of the security and convenience of biometrics without having those risks. Now, conversely, once you get beyond authentication, if you start to look at something like remote identity proofing, that may be where you might need to have some sort of a cloud implementation where, biometrics are going to be matched and compared. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit, later in this webinar, but I just wanted to flag, at least in the authentication area, it's really become a best practice.
Then I just want to add one small comment going back to the legal side. The courts in BIPA have actually recognized the benefits of on-device processing for authentication. It's an Illinois appellate court case, so it's not binding, but they said that if there's a certain set of factors that include the processing all taking place on the device and the data not being transferred to the company's servers, or that the company doesn't otherwise have access to that data, that can take you outside of the scope of the law. So that is a major benefit for the on-device processing that should be one of many considerations when looking at different tools to use.
So a decision that is essentially motivated by data protection, biometric data security concerns is getting reflected in the law, and it does provide certain liability protection in this area of a lot of litigation.
Correct. And then if you add in user control in there, I would just caveat that it won't provide you with complete liability protection because BIPA is so uncertain. But if you're trying to manage your risks, this is one of the best ways to try and reduce the level.
Absolutely. So we've got a really valuable tool to ensure responsible and ethical use of biometrics there. But Stephanie, what about situations where we want to store our toxic waste equivalent in the data sense? Jeremy mentioned that there's uses beyond authentication for biometrics where a different architecture may be needed. So what can you tell us about cloud implementations and responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are many cases where, particularly for onboarding, right? So if you're in a industry that has requirements around onboarding, and I'll let the experts speak to that, right? About knowing who your customer is, or things like, health data, you have a higher level of responsibility, and that's usually in that first step. It also can be in a step, if somebody, loses their password, and you sort of have to kind of re-identify them. So these technologies, for authentication and locally stored biometrics don't necessarily solve all problems. And so remote identity proofing, has become kind of the term of art to kind of understand, what we're doing here. Often those systems use a document, that as part of the point of reference, either by querying the document or taking a photograph of the document, or potentially, hopefully in the future, or in some cases around the world where you can actually tap into the authoritative source, right? Say DMVs in the United States, identity, national identity places. So where's the biometric then? So that's one part of the biometric, the authoritative source, which includes, your biometric, as well as then the second step, you proving yourself that you match that authoritative source, and so that's the second step, said colloquially, taking a selfie, right, to match against that authoritative source of biometrics. And so, there can be a lot of really good reasons why you want to adopt those types of solutions. Obviously you have to take care, as was described earlier, but, things to consider, include how long are you keeping that data, right? Who's the one taking the data? We talked about third parties, right? So you've got the consumer, you've got, the relying party, and usually maybe a vendor who's actually doing the work for you. So understanding, that ecosystem and in terms of the policies, processes, and as well as technology that Isabelle talked about. So how long are you keeping the data? Can that data be, if removed, as needed, right? And certainly, how that data might be, whether that data might be used for something else, right? And if you're thinking, okay, I'm going to use it for one thing and now I want to use it for another, that's a major red flag, obviously, in terms of getting consent. So, but I do want to also bring up, while you do need to think carefully about the legal considerations, you also need to think carefully about if you don't do it, right? And so the Identity Theft Resource Center, actually some of my colleagues here on the panel, we participated in a report about biometrics and identity theft, because as we know today, for something like remote identity proofing, right? I already know when David's birthday is. I just learned it today, right? A lot of information about people, are available, not only in kind of the open web, but also in the dark web. And so, biometrics it isn't just another piece of data. It adds actual relationship between the electronics and the real person. And because most systems have something called liveness in them, it's very hard, even if you have a photograph of someone, to use that data effectively. So you might also ask your question, what if I don't do this? Am I, from an individual point of view, being susceptible to identity fraud, but from the point of view of the organization, the fraud that comes with that identity theft. So read that document, another resource for people to look at.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If I can just
Sure,
weigh
yeah,
into what
please.
Stephanie pointed out, it's, sometimes you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, and that the alternatives to use of biometrics might actually be a lot worse. I mean, we've certainly seen this in the US, where we saw, big controversy explode about 2 years ago when the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, was using a selfie match solution where you scan a picture of your driver's license or passport and then take a selfie as part of proving who you are to access, what I would call high value, high trust services online with the IRS, where if you don't know, or the IRS can't figure out that you're you, odds are pretty good that criminals can impersonate you and steal a lot of your data and probably some of your money. And so you actually have a need to really know at a pretty high level of assurance who's who. Well, look, face isn't perfect, and depending on the algorithm or the solution, you might have some bias issues that need to be addressed. And so you saw a lot of activists pile on and demand that we stop using it. Well, okay, what are you going to do next? What do you want the world to look like afterwards? And one point we made is there's a reason you're seeing organizations use these selfie match solutions, is that they actually tend to be more accurate and in many cases more equitable than the legacy solutions that they're replacing. So for years, the de facto way in the US and a lot of other countries to do remote identity proofing was knowledge-based verification, where we'll tee up, say, 4 or 5 questions from your credit report, and if you can answer them properly, it proves that you're you. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One, we've had so many data breaches that not only do you know the answers to the questions, but so do a lot of the bad guys, to the point that a lot of the banks I work with say if somebody answers those quizzes too quickly and too accurately, it's a sign of fraud. People usually miss one or they take some time to think about it. The second is a big chunk of Americans don't actually have much of a credit history. And so if that's what you're drawing from for these questions, it actually excludes a lot of people. And, look, I've, certainly seen this with some of the implementations I've been involved in, both in government and industry. Introducing biometrics and selfie match might get you from, say, 65% approvals to 85%. And if I'm, a 19-year-old African-American who does not have a credit history, but has a cell phone and a driver's license, I might actually have a path forward here to prove who I am and access a service online that I wouldn't have if we were only using these data-based solutions. So, too many times in identity, everybody's looking for what's the perfect solution. And the answer is, you're not going to find that. More often than not, it comes down to what sucks less. Which is a terrible tagline for, an industry that I've made my living in for years. But nothing's perfect. Everything has trade-offs. And so, to Stephanie's point earlier, biometrics, even if they're not 100% perfect, they suck less than some of the things they're replacing, and they can actually be more inclusive and equitable than some of the things they're replacing. And that gets lost sometime in these discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So the expression goes, and I'm really glad that Stephanie, that you brought up liveness, which factors into, is such an important factor when discussing the risks around storage and so on, storage and architecture, which has been a lot of our focus. But Jeremy, you raised the issue of bias, and we've been talking a little bit about inclusiveness. I'd like to get into that a little bit on the sort of algorithm versus implementation side, because we've seen, NIST has done a couple of big tests on this, and the first one showed a real range from not so much differential between demographics among the best algorithms to some algorithms that shouldn't be ever commercially used and haven't been, in fact. The updated test shows better results. So more of those leading algorithms that you might actually see out there have very low demographic differentials, or in some cases, practically no difference between races. But in some cases, we still see implementations that use these apparently very fine algorithms where things go awry, or a certain group, often darker skinned people, are getting excluded, or the system is returning errors. And so I wanted to ask you, where does responsibility lie in that kind of a situation?
I think it's ultimately on the implementer. And, with that, okay, great, you're using an algorithm that has sort of fit into that quadrant of, it's been tested as both accurate and equitable. But if you're not also monitoring how it's being used in practice, and taking some time to assess where you're seeing failures, and whether there's perhaps one demographic group or one type of your customers that are struggling more. Look, it's very important to monitor for disparate aspects, disparate impacts of biometrics, even if the algorithm that you're using is the best.
So back to the start early and stay late kind of approach to actually covering all your bases. It's not just pick the right modality, pick the right algorithm, check, and away we go.
I mean, a lot of times it's dependent on things like the camera you're using, the angle the camera's on, the lighting. If you're doing something like auto capture, on a smartphone, how well does that work, and does it really snap the picture at the right time? I mean, there's just a whole bunch of different variables that are out there. And I wish I could say that as an industry, we kind of had it all figured out, but we're still learning. And also the technology is improving a lot each year. I mean, I point out, like, certainly some of these AI powered systems, something that might not have worked as well with a low quality camera a few years ago. There might be other, tools you can have beyond the algorithm, just in the overall system to compensate for it. So there really are a lot of different variables. I will say, in general, I think it's more important to be focusing on overall system performance and potential demographic disparities, as opposed to just the algorithm. I feel like we've had a little bit too much attention where some of my friends on the left have been just with great glee pointing out that NIST has shown that some algorithms have bias, and setting aside the fact that this has also said those that are most accurate tend to be the most equitable. as somebody who actually worries about, over time, less about the bias, which I think is going to get worked out in these systems, and more just how we're using biometrics and whether we are using it in places like in surveillance that I'm not personally comfortable. My concern is if a lot of activists just focus on bias. Well, look, just give the tech another 4 or 5 years, and these systems will be frighteningly accurate. And what I don't want to see on that side is a situation where, you'll see some people on the implementation side say, well, we solved all the bias problems. Great. Now we can have surveillance everywhere. We should really be thinking ahead around where's this technology going? Where do we want to see biometrics be used? Other places we don't want to be. What are what's the world we want to live in? And I feel like that's lacking from some of these conversations right now, because everybody instead is just focusing on bias issues that I think have, at least in the algorithm side, with the best of the algorithms, have largely been addressed by industry and are going to continue to get much more accurate.
And Jeremy, I like to add, because it's quite interesting what you said, because one other issue that we're seeing that often is forgotten is you need to continue maintaining your system. You don't just put it in, now I've got it, we're done, it will run. So you need to retest the people using your system. The demographic of people using your system might change as well. And so I think that's also something that we need to be very clear about, that, once it's in place, is actually when your journey really starts. That's when the work starts. We often have seen people say, no, we're not even renewing our membership with the Biometrics Institute because the project has been implemented, the system is running, and we're all good. And I think that's created problems as well. That impacts on the perception of the public out there. And it is clearly not the silver bullet, but like you said as well, there's constant work. I mean, that's what I'm passionate about. There's a community of people who constantly work on this issue. You see them here talking about it, and there's many more. So yes, I think there's great hope.
Absolutely.
I also think, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead, David, please.
Going back to the FTC again, in their Rite Aid settlement from December of last year, one of the big components that Rite Aid was required to implement is a biometric system monitoring program. That includes 2 core elements: our pre-deployment risk assessments, and then once deployment has happened, regular ongoing reassessments and just general monitoring and oversight once that technology is put into play, to make sure that it's operating correctly.
Absolutely. So an ethical and increasing regulatory priority.
If you focus on the ethics and responsible use of biometrics, it's a great way to get you a long way towards managing your legal risks and liability exposure. So they go hand in hand.
Absolutely. And on that note, we're running towards the end of our time, but just before I turn to contributions from the audience, I just want to ask Isabelle, as we try and navigate these tricky ethical and responsibility questions, can you fill in a little bit more about the resources that are available to guide businesses and different organizations?
Yeah, like I said, there's a wealth of knowledge out there. It is truly amazing how this community has grown, and as I said, addressed this issue for decades. It's not a new thing. Biometrics have been around. Well, certainly the Biometrics Institute has been around 23 years, so it's not just arrived. So of course we've heard from David. I mean, there are the regulators and that put legislation in place, and that is an important place to look. Is there something there that you need to know? But ISO, the International Standards Organization, has also for many years worked on technical standards. So that's certainly a place to look. And we've heard already about NIST, who are doing independent testing, but there are others who are in fact doing independent testing as well around bias. We've heard about performance, etc. In the government space, there's lots of organizations like the International Civil Aviation Organization and the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. Now, you might think, if I'm a commercial entity, why should I look there? Well, the reason you should look there is that the recommended practices are not all that different. It is still the same issues that you need to address, and that's where a lot of the work has been done. So many individuals, experts that are available, and of course the Institute, Biometrics Institute, provides that place to kind of navigate through that, and where we see that standards and legislation can't keep pace because they need to be well considered, that's where we come in and provide guidance in a collaborative approach with our members through education, information, and really understanding that what you see out there in media as headlines is not where you get your guidance, but there's a community of people who together really constantly work on that issue. So yeah, but I can only say it's going to be hard work. If you think this is cool, we can do a selfie thing, use the phone and do it, you will probably find, depending on what your implementation is, that you end up with a lot of problems if you don't do it. Do all that homework from a start. And you asked that question earlier, Chris. Policy, I mean, we have said when you look at an implementation, what's the actual cost of an implementation? When you look at policy, process, technology, if you think all your costs should go into technology, I think you've made the wrong decision. You will probably find that policy is one of the hardest things to address and bring all your stakeholders onto that journey. So if you don't start there, you might be surprised where you end up with your implementation.
So take advantage of those resources. They're well needed. Absolutely. So that's very valuable information, I think, for anyone who's trying to really wrap their heads around these challenges. I would like to turn to our contributions from those of you who've joined us. So thank you very much to everyone who's both been listening along and to those who have submitted questions. And I'd like to start with one question I think is really interesting. When monitoring biometric processes to minimize discrimination, how do you balance the privacy and security of PII used to analyze performance? So ethical consideration brought in, a challenge brought in by trying to deal with a different ethical consideration. How do we keep this data safe? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
I can take a crack at it. So I may be reading something into it that they're not asking, but one of the things when you think about monitoring, right, is what are you monitoring, right? So you have success rate, of course, right, of the particular individuals, or you might have success rate. So presumably that's part of what you're monitoring, but you don't probably have a lot of other information about that person depending on the situation. And so that's what makes that really hard, because how do you say, well, I'm still equitable when all I have is just success rate, right? So I don't even necessarily have anything on fraud, right? So you need some kind of process for ground truthing what you're doing, and so it's very use case dependent. So it's really hard for me to tell you exactly what to do generally, but understand you'll need some kind of red teaming potentially, maybe some known subjects going through where you have information, relate beyond, that success rate about those individuals from different groups. So, if it involves, ID documents, you can do some estimation and looking across, states and, regions, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is very much use case dependent, but I was guessing that was part of what might be the source of that question, because it's not there's no easy answer on that one.
Absolutely. Yeah. And an important point at the same time. You need to do it even though it's hard, kind of thing. Another good question here. How does a tech provider typically gain consent from a third-party user? David or Jeremy, want to take that?
I'll take that, and unless Jeremy wants to.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So with the vendors that don't directly interface, they usually have to make sure their contractual arrangements require the customer who does have that direct connection with the end users that they provide notice and obtain consent on the vendor's behalf. And then also, relatedly, there's a question about if a company does not actively take an active step towards collecting biometric data, they're off the hook. That's one of the buzzwords that the courts use, is an active step. And it's also, I need to preface this with the fact that courts are not in unison on it. But some courts have said without an active step that you're outside of what is termed as collecting, and collecting requires notice and consent. But even if you're not collecting, you're the vendor and you're just receiving data and storing it up in the cloud, that's considered possession. So then you have to do the privacy policy, data retention requirements, and the rest of everything except for pre-collection notice and consent. And the tricky thing here is that a lot of courts have said, well, if you possess biometric data, somehow you collected it. So you are oftentimes on the hook, even when you're not actively collecting, especially at the motion to dismiss stage, where courts are extremely hesitant to dismiss a BIPA class action at the pleading stage.
Right, absolutely. We're just about out of time. I would just like to answer one more question, which I'm sorry for everyone who has submitted a question. There's some really great questions here that we're just not going to have time for today. But I would like to ask this. One of our attendees asks, assuming the actual biometric is not kept, does biometric tokenization offer a solution to avoid possible biometric penalties? And are there standards to validate the absence of biometric data leakage when using biometric tokenization? Anyone want to weigh in on tokenization and liability?
Well, I'll let David follow up to my answer, but I will say what I understand they're trying to say is that instead of the biometric being stored locally, there is some kind of process that extracts a key from the biometric data, and that key gets stored on a server such that, you know, if the person comes into another device, right, that they can then still match against that tokenized. And the whole idea of the tokenization is that data that's being stored cannot be reverse engineered to the original data. That's a fairly sophisticated technology. If I were to make a guess, you know, from a legal point of view, it's very difficult to prove that that data can't be backtracked to the original data, and thus that might not be your way out. I'll let David tell me whether that's the right.
You're right. As you might have guessed, the courts aren't really that sophisticated in the technology behind what's going on in these BIPA disputes. So they basically said that if you take any type of biometric identifier information and convert it into some other type of data, that still falls under the scope of identifiers or information that is covered by BIPA. So just turning your whatever the output is into some random generated numbers and letters, that's not enough to push you outside scope.
But can contribute probably to potentially at least to a responsible and, you know, secure implementation, right?
I agree 100%. I just speaking strictly from a BIPA standpoint.
Tokenization is a topic for another webinar series of webinars. Many discussions to be had there for sure. I again want to thank all of our panelists today and all of you who joined us. Has been, as expected, a very insightful, enlightening, and engaging conversation. I just want to quickly mention David's book, Biometric Data Privacy Compliance and Best Practices. You can find it on the LexisNexis website, for instance. So there's a resource for you. Biometricsinstitute.org. That's where you go to find a number of the resources that we discussed today. I also would encourage everyone to check out CITER.clarkson.edu. Some good resources, a lot of in-depth information. Visit Venable.com as well. Baker Donelson, there are a lot of resources, both documents and people who you can find to help you on this journey. So I want to leave you with that and thank everyone for joining us. And I look forward to talking to you all again soon, more about biometrics and digital identity. So until then, stay safe and have fun.
Thanks, everyone.